Hi there, my name's Oscar Clark and I'm from Fundamentally Games, and thanks to the people behind the Cocos Game Developers Connect conference for inviting me to speak here. I'm going to talk for the next 30 minutes around the topic of hypercasual versus games as a service, and in particular focusing on the lessons that any casual game developer can take from that. Let's define some terms. We're going to be looking specifically at hypercasual, meaning those simple, fast experiences where you can fail quickly, but also where the developer is focused on identifying games and deleting them and killing them very quickly. So failing fast applies both to the player potentially, but definitely applies to the developer. That means that we drive low cost of development because we're not focusing all of our attention on creating the full game before we test it. And also they become much more mass market because simplicity rules. Of course, the consequence of that simplicity is that they generally are only ad funded and they're not focused on retention. Games as a service, on the other hand, are all about depth of experience. They're about creating living games where retention is king because retention drives revenue. That means, by definition, they will have a much more focused audience than a hyper-casual game, and it also unlocks the ability for mixed monetization. They're not better or worse than the other. They are different strategies to developing games. So I'm going to start off by looking at the hyper-casual model. I've taken some data, in this case, from the platform Reflection, where I'm looking at kind of the peaks and troughs, looking at the downloads over the duration of the life of the game and the revenue mapped against the life of the game. Of course, this kind of service, similar to App Annie or Apptopia, are based on the data that is publicly available, so the rankings from the Apple and Google stores, and they're extrapolating to get this kind of data. But even then, it's still very, very valuable. So I can see the classic here, the peak of downloads, and then that basically drops very quickly. And then there are a few peaks where clearly there's been some campaigning going on and maybe some updates. The important thing here is that the monetization generally tracks against the downloads. There isn't really much in this way of retention. And you can see that because the curves are so similar. So what is in a game as a hyper-casual game? What's the process of getting it? Well, obviously the typical process, and I'm sure there are different variants, is that we have lots and lots of ideas. We choose some of those to create 2-day builds, really, really small builds. And our 2 days an arbitrary number. Some teams will use, a week, 2 weeks, even less potentially. The idea is that you're going to time box a very small amount of work to be able to immediately test it in the market. That means getting the game out onto Facebook or some other kind of platform and testing immediately with simple graphics, asset store images, something which makes it clear what the game's about, but doesn't necessarily have to be costly or difficult to deliver. We immediately test, and if the games don't meet the KPIs we've defined in advance, KPIs like the retention level. What's day one retention? Is it over 60% or is it under 60%? We will pick the right number for us. Some teams choose 60% for hyper-casual games. Other teams choose 40 to 45%. Casual games that are longer term don't necessarily have to have that high a level of retention, although obviously it's great if they do. Another example of the KPI could be the cost for install. If the cost of install is above, say, 20 cents or 50 cents, depending on your target, your likely return, that will tell you whether this game goes. So it's a black and white thing. We're not just working off our heads. We're actually saying we're looking for mechanics that meet these KPIs, and that is it. If they don't meet them, we kill them. If we find one that succeeds those KPIs, those harsh KPIs, then we see the game passes. We start to optimize, particularly optimizing costs per install. But of course, there'll be an optimization process around revenue too, particularly the placement of ads. But focusing on cost is, to me, the profound change of strategy that hyper-casual completely personifies. It's an idea where we can create the best way to be sure that before we start dedicating expensive resources to make the game polished, we know the game will work. But it's not perfect. There are some flaws to it. For example, failure to hide, the failure process can actually hide potential gems. We've seen examples, I think Space 8 had one, where the art theme prevented the game attracting the right audience. But that's a kind of exceptional case. Because we can always come up with new ideas, we can later consider whether there's an alternative way to take a mechanic. But in general, if the mechanic doesn't work, it's either down to the timing of it, i.e. players aren't ready for it, or it's down to the fact that it's just not compelling enough. And being hard and fast and killing the games that don't work to the KPIs we set in advance is really important. It also happens to have a flaw because it doesn't focus on retention. So games will be very short-lived, and we need to think differently if we're going to be able to extend them. But on the positive side, the rapid feedback and the iteration that happens means that we learn incredibly fast the things that work and the things that don't. We're not held back by having to wait for the full development cycle of a year or 2 years before we know whether the game is going to work. And as a result, we get through more and more games. I know some games companies where they've gone through hundreds of games and released 2 or 3, maybe 5 of those games. That kind of proportion is all about learning and being kind of taking on board the lessons of what you get from the data. It also means that these games can be a rapid route to short-term success, because if we can find a game that works, we can get it out, we can get revenue for it, and then we can move on to the next. There are lots of hyper-casual publishers now that are working with teams who have a knack to be able to find these gems that have high retention and low CPI, and they start doing a relationship which has a subscription kind of arrangement. So essentially, the developer studio is guaranteed some level of revenue based off the propositions they put together for that publisher. But so it's a difficult thing to work out, but essentially, it's all about being fast and really crucially brutal on your KPIs and saying, I will kill these games unless they are exceptional. There's also another angle on it, on hypercasual, which is that there's a masterclass of A/B testing going on, particularly around how we optimize around the cost per install. The use of ads, both in terms of the revenue inside the game, but particularly on how we attract audiences, has to be incredibly effective. You have to look at all the different possible mediums for that, the kind of formats, whether it's a video ad, a banner ad, an interstitial, whether it's a playable ad. And in fact, what we've found through looking at this kind of process, the more variety seems to have the best effect, particularly if those promotional campaigns are layering on top of others to be able to build a hype around the game model. But of course, it's also getting the right timing, because if audiences are looking for this kind of game because there is other games like this, it becomes very competitive very quickly. From a design point of view, we have to think of hypercasuals, I think, like a fidget spinner, something which is just designed to fill time for now. So something which is mechanic, very easy, that's non-threatening, that is just reactive, is an incredibly good way to go, particularly if it then feeds into the watching of ads, and importantly, needs some form of tease. I use the term unfinished business to describe that sometimes. The idea that if I have a puzzle and I've got one piece left to put in, but I've run out of time, I have this nagging desire to complete that process. That sense, that need to complete, that unfinished business, is an incredibly powerful piece for the kind of games we're talking about with hypercasual. Simple, compelling, desirable actions that I can repeat and repeat and repeat, and provide a great space for the ad side of the business to be able to show ads to that player. And these things can be incredibly fun. And in fact, what we find is if you focus down on one interaction, a touch, a swipe, a tap, a shake. I mean, I haven't seen anyone blow into the microphone, but theoretically those kind of mechanics could potentially work. Bit unlikely, but it's possible. But what is important is making those one interactions extensible. So in the game on the left, Sky Rollers, I'm sliding left and right, and that is moving the legs of the character, the avatar, accordingly to avoid the obstacles or to run on the rails. So I'm in charge. It's my action, And it's my timing that makes the difference of that gameplay. Plank, the second one, is about holding the screen, and while I'm touching the screen, the length of the plank grows and then releasing at the right time. If I release too early, my character falls off. If I release too late, my character falls off. If I release just right, I get a perfect score. So it's still down to me. It's one interaction, a tap and hold, and then release. And it's the timing, the tap, the hold, and the release that makes all the difference. Next up, we've got the idea of basically pulling back and releasing. And we see the curve of where the path is going to go because of the angle that we're pulling back and the level that we're pulling back to. So we have some level of understanding that it's our choice of the path as we move from dot to dot to dot and avoid the red areas and ideally catch the objects that appear during the game. Now I threw in this fourth one, this the game from Homer Games, which is all about basically an idle building mechanic. The idea is this is building the one of the pyramids, and it's just an idle mechanic. It's clicking. It's like clicking. Now, why is that a hyper-casual game? Because they've reduced all of the complexity. And it's interesting to see how a game like this allows us to challenge what our perceptions are of what a game is. I can choose where I'm going to tap. Each tap has a cost. Therefore, I have control in what I'm tapping because I have a certain budget. How I allocate that budget and how I increase the rate in which I earn more coins becomes the way that I control that interaction. So moving on from that, I think one thing that's really important is owning failure. Now, there are some games which are making failure almost unrelated to a hyper-casual game. I'm not particularly interested in that direction. That may be my bias, but I feel like there's much more power in creating replay where there is failure, but where the player owns it. The problem is if we have games where players feel like the game is too hard, where the game is frustrating, and to the extent where it overcomes their desire to play that unfinished business I talked about earlier. If failure seems too likely, we won't bother. So failure should be an option, but failure should be something we can delight in and feel like it's our fault, because when we overcome that failure and start being successful on repeat plays, it's an incredibly enjoyable response. That's where we get our dopamine, response. So understanding that and realizing that we can own failure as players is a really powerful thing. But it also is important, as I said earlier, the idea that we create games and kill them, that type of failure is something as a team we should celebrate too, because we've knocked out one new thing which we thought was going to be successful and we now know it's not, so we know more. We should congratulate people who can produce material even when it doesn't work, provided it's showing a direction towards success. So success, is hyper-casual still healthy in 2020? If you read a report by Eric Surfert, in November, you would feel like there was no more hyper-casual. Hyper-casual was dead because of the cannibalization of advertising, because of the way programmatic-based bidding is affecting the choices that people make, which is making the ads inside a hyper-casual game less valuable, arguably. All very solid, very sensible arguments, and I generally agree with Eric. However, when you talk to somebody like John at Homer Games, or you talk to Falco at Joypack, it's clear that there is a incredible business here in terms of actually understanding what hyper-casual should be about. And for me, that's about making the cheapest development process possible, the cheapest cost for install possible, and then focusing on revenue for that game. And if that is the case, then I think that hyper-casual is very healthy. What we'll see is systematic processes coming into place, great use of data coming into place, so that we can make fewer, cheaper experiments faster. And I think we're already seeing that in the way that the types of companies that are at the top of the charts have been changing over the last year in particular. Because I think simplicity is an incredible skill, and not everybody can do it. I struggle with it myself. It's the ultimate sophistication. It is not easy to make something simple and still good. And so really focusing down on simplicity, cost reduction, I think could arguably make hyper-casual games some of the most pure play experiences on the planet. So here are some five lessons to take away from hyper-casual. Create one interaction. Focus on unfinished business and extensibility. But be prepared to kill your darlings early, because less is more. So let's move on now to games as a service. So the games as a service model is where the game is living, where it's ongoing. And I've taken Pokemon Go here as an example. What you'll see here is that whilst the downloads follows a very similar pattern to the hyper-casual game Plank, what you've seen here is that the revenues do not match that. In fact, the revenues are significantly higher than the level in terms of the curve of the downloads. That means they are gaining benefits from retention. And that's the reason why games as a service models are so potentially effective. But let's look at the game as a service design structure or development process. So we do some market analysis, something to a certain extent we don't bother with hyper-casual, or haven't historically. I think increasingly we are, but historically it wasn't the case. We're then taking that market analysis and we're doing design and prototyping. And we might be doing some testing, but we're not generally at this point in time doing market testing for that. We then develop that game. And once it's developed, we can then do our soft launches and betas and alphas and so on and so forth. But what that means is the market testing comes after we've made a game, because if a game has depth, you have to build that depth before you can properly test it in context. And that means that when we then release the game, we'll have ongoing releases all focused around extending not just the cost for install, but the long-term lifetime value of the player. So this model has its advantages and disadvantages as well. There's a lot of sunk development costs before market testing. There's also a high risk when you do that testing, because if the game doesn't work and you put all this effort in putting it together, you've just lost a lot of money. So that's the risk. So what we have to do is focus on a true MVP. So minimum viable product is still one of my favorite phrases. A lot of people have gone off it, wanting the minimum fun product or the minimum profitable product. Lots of various options for it. But viable product are two things I think are really important here. So the smallest successful, deliverable, achievable in terms of the experience for the player, but also for the return for the developer product. That's what I think MVP means. And if we can get that, then we can minimize our risk to an extent. But games as a service will always be more difficult because of the need to create a full extendable experience. But we'll come back to that. There are some positives. We can focus on player utility. I think this is really key. The value, the satisfaction of the wants of the player is what utility is all about. And games as a service is especially good at doing that, because the whole purpose of a game as a service is to maintain a relationship over 30, 60, 90 days, maybe a years, maybe 5 years. There are games on the App Store today that have been going for 8+ years. And they're still successful, and they're still reasonably high in the charts. That's an incredible feat. It also means that we can use features to drive that long-term retention. So we don't just stay still. It's a truism that over 80% of the work of a game happens after launch with a game as a service. And understanding what that means in terms of driving your community and player base forward over time and sustaining their engagement, that's when we can have people who love the game so much it becomes their hobby, and at that point they're willing to spend tens of pounds, hundreds of pounds, even thousands of pounds. There are examples of games where people have spent hundreds of thousands of pounds in them because it's become something that's important to their personality. So games and services are like onions. They start with a mechanic. So the mechanic is not dissimilar to what we have with a fidget spinner earlier, but there's a start condition, there's a challenge, there's a resolution, and then there's a reward. They still have to have that tease, and they still have to have that repeatability, because you need to be able to have something where you can grind, you can replay. Otherwise, how are you going to keep someone playing for years? You can't just build solid pieces of content that are used once in a game as a service. They have to be repeatable. So how do you make it interesting to repeat it? Well, that's where you have extensibility. Oh, that sounds a bit familiar. That's what made the hyper-casual game so interesting. But in terms of games as a service, there are other areas we can look at. It's not just the interaction that we can have as extensible. We can have time, i.e. how fast do I complete something, or how much time do I spend doing something. We can have score, i.e. how many points do I get. We can have skill, we can have grind, we can have choices that we make. Different choices, different time can have different effects. And we can have the attributes. So we can have, strength and health, speed of our vehicle, how much fuel our car takes. All of these variables can start playing a factor in what gameplay does, and we can use them to generate power-ups and other types of extensibility, other types of goods that we can then sell to people, as well as giving to them as rewards through play. Beyond that, we start thinking about the context of the play. So, what makes us, why do we want to keep playing those mechanics? So there we're talking about a sense of unfinished business, which we talked about before. That's the one that hyper-casual games keep. But what games as a service do as well is look at things like purpose and progression. So why am I doing this? And can I see how far I've come, that I have been successful? It can be built around an economy, how I need to build something up in order to unlock something else, and how that works, or what the exchange rates, and how the sinks and sources in the game take the resources and the efforts that we put into play and allow us to unlock new and more exciting things. A key thing we often forget about is anticipation. In games as a service, that becomes really important. We have to anticipate the value of coming back tomorrow and playing again and again and again. Creating anticipation can be around narrative, it can be around excitement of the results by being close, that tease that we talked about. But again, that's a really important thing that needs to be explored, whether you're doing games as a service or if you even arguably a hyper-casual game. Beyond the context loop, we're now looking at the metagame. And for me, the metagame is about cultural expression. Why would somebody share what their successes look like in the game with other people? Why would they? Why would somebody go on Twitch? Why would somebody go to an influencer? Why would an influencer play this game to show their audience why this game is so exciting? Have you ever, when you think about that, when you're making a casual game, what's in it for the players to share with each other and feel like they're part of a community? That social engagement, whether there's collaboration, whether there's gifting, whether there's sharing. Human beings are social beasts, and it's easy to underestimate the power of personalization, of communication, the sense of social identity that can come from belonging to a community of game players. Fortnite is a fantastic example where we've seen people wanting to actually show off outfits that they've earned that they don't see themselves in most of the time. And then you see events like Marshmallow doing a gig inside Fortnite. That to me is mind-blowing, because it means that the game is only the meeting point. It's the melting pot in which interaction happens. For those things to have happened at all, though, we have to be really aware of the lifestyle fit of the game and also the mode of use. So how does it fit into my daily routine as a person? But also, how does it affect the devices that I use to play the game? Because they can have a profound effect on the game itself. So the next onion, and I could do more layers, but let's leave it here, is to look at the game as a live ops experience. So that means looking at events, so reasons to come back tomorrow, some excitement that continues in the game, punctuation, these kind of punctuation points through the long-term experience that make it worthwhile and enjoyable. The Kubrick-like moment where we remember that thing, the unforgettable moment when we did this together. That's what events should be about. And alongside events come promotions, so reasons to want to spend money, reasons to care, fear of missing out. If I don't get that thing right now, buy one get one free, limited time available. Then we've got things like content releases, which should be feeding into those events and those promotions, creating a sense of desire, creating a sense of ongoing refreshment of the game. And features, new features should be like tent poles that we know is coming, we can look forward to. We may not know the specifics. There's a sort of sense of predictable uncertainty when new features come along, but we know how much time people spend talking about the new features of a new game, like a Fortnite or a Call of Duty or even Clash Royale. There's so many things where those things become part of the social zeitgeist. And we can't forget community is an integral part of the experience, and I think should increasingly be at the heart of every game developer. Your community manager should be the people who you go to because they're the eyes and ears of your game. In fact, they should be helping within the user acquisition side, they should be helping with the development strategy side in order to deliver audience-led decision making. And of course, we have to have problem management too. So thinking about games like onions means we can slice up the layers. And whilst live ops like this looks really complicated, I hope you'll agree that when we step through step by step, you can see each layer can be identified individually. Why do we do these layers? We do these layers because players have life cycles. Games as a service taps into that, and that's its essential power. So we're looking at how, when initially we see games that go through a stage of discovery, players find the game and they decide binary, do they install or not install? So your App Store optimization, your ad campaigns, your art style, your visuals, your screen grabs are really kind of critical. And then once they install, then you see the opportunity for them to learn how to play the game. But it's not just about learning to play the game. They're also learning how the game fits into their daily routine. Once they get past that, then they start engaging. And that engagement is what drives basically the opportunities for revenue, the opportunities for attention, the opportunities for increased lifetime value. And that's where we find those people have the potential to super engage. And of course, we can also see how we can re-engage players before they start to leave. In fact, maybe we can start getting them back, by having special offers and events and promotions, all those live ops pieces. Finally, we have to accept that people will leave. People do churn. That's inevitable. And that's okay. Let them leave with a positive feeling so they still rate the game highly, and hopefully have good memories so that when we come up with the next game that they want to take part in an experience like that. And perhaps maybe we can re-engage. I also like to think about this life cycle like a funnel. So obviously there's a lot more people who are going to discover your game. They're going to actually spend time learning how to play it. We'll see a lot of drop-offs. Then we'll see people engaging will be a shorter, smaller subset of that. And then converting, i.e. spending money or watching ads. And then finally super engaging. If you think about those kind of stages. What's interesting is we see the idea that you've got to basically convert, kind of engage people from discovery to engagement. And then you have to convert them to spending. But they're influenced, so the engaged players are often influenced by the items and the experiences that they can see that super engaged players have. If you don't facilitate your game to be able to let people see what's going on as a game of a service, it's going to be difficult to sort of see that growth and that aspiration. It's also interesting how engaging users are the ones who provide that kind of level of virality that then comes from them sharing their experiences with the people. Now, it's not the same as it was back in the day of the Facebook kind of social game era. We're not talking about, oh, here's a free bit of reward if you watch my video, but it can still be an important part of word of mouth, and word of mouth still remains the best way to acquire new users. So what is game as a service in short? Well, it's about player engagement. So more players doing more things more often for longer. So what are the 5 takeaways for games as a service? It's simple, extensible play. It's unfinished business. It's a sense of purpose and progression, a predictable surprise, and understanding the player life cycle. So 5 different takeaways than the hyper-casual game. And it's those differences which means that you can't just take a hyper-casual game and slap on a metagame. Well, why is that? It's because different games have different needs. If you look at Rollerball at the left-hand side here versus EVE Online at the right, you can see that there's a depth and complexity which increases from left to right. But the potential reach reduces from left to right and increases from right to left. There's a much bigger mass market audience because there are fewer barriers and complications for a game that's hyper-casual like Rollerball. And on the other side, it's a sophisticated, deep, rich game, which is increasing retention and longevity of the player who manages to stay with that game. So different games have different models. But also, we have to understand that monetization has a price. So if you have something like an in-world ad or audio-based ads that don't interfere with gameplay, that's a lot lower frustration for the player because they can just get on with the game and they don't have to interact with anything at that point. Even in-game currency, I would argue, is a form of exchange and itself has a low level of fatigue. I often play games where I don't want to give up the stars that I've earned because I've earned them. If I give them up to buy something, I've got to care about the value of that difference. So if I don't know the difference is valuable to me, I don't do it. Rewarded ads, I love. I've spent several years as evangelist for Unity ads, and I'm a huge fan of this model still to this day, where you watch an ad for a reward. Now, I happen to not be a fan of playable ads because I think that takes the player away from the player experience they chose and into a player experience they didn't. But I know that they can be incredibly effective. And especially if you're a hyper-casual game, you want your ad to be playable in many cases, at least one variation of your ads, because that tells people the gameplay immediately. In fact, we've actually seen people doing fake gameplay because the gameplay itself is interesting that they put in the playable. That takes people to the game, and then when people play that game, they happen to already be the kind of people who might like this new game, even if the gameplay is different. That kind of bait and switch, though, is very dangerous. If it doesn't resonate with the same audience, you can annoy a lot of people. Anyway, back to the plot point. Rewarded ads are great because they have a great balance between desire. I choose as a player to watch an ad to get something to play in this game. And that can be a really good balance between the player fatigue that happens with barriers of watching an ad and revenue versus the value for the player. Interstitials are complicated. They can be very valuable. They can also be very damaging to the player journey if their timing is wrong. They can be very frustrating and they can actually have an impact on the long-term retention of that player. So there are some places where hyper-casual games, for example, is a really good example of why interstitials can work. Where it's timed so that in the relief part of playing, so we have a frustration and relief cycle when we play games. Playing creates intensity. After that intensity, we often need a break. So that's actually a great point to put an interstitial. And if you can get back into playing immediately afterwards, then that interstitial takes less away from the player. And I think there's a really strong argument about understanding the balance of player excitement versus player fatigue. Then we talk about non-reoccurring payments. So an in-app purchase, there's a large barrier to get somebody to go from doing something for free to spending any money, whether that money is 1 cent, 2 cents, or $1, $2, or £100 or £300. Doesn't matter what the value is, the difference between free and something is the biggest barrier. So we have to make our in-app purchases completely understandable, and we have to make them very desirable, and ideally create a fear of missing out. If I don't get this thing, I'm losing an opportunity. So it's important that the value has to increase, dramatically, but also we have to understand its placement and timing and how we draw people to want to spend. Often we find that later in the cycle of a player journey, that people start spending who spend more money longer term. Often we find people who spend up front can be kind of one-time spenders. So if you see someone spending on day one, it's worth paying attention. Now, whilst that's true, we saw a phenomenon, particularly in South Korea, where people front load games. So they will spend money up front and later as well. But I'm not sure that every game has got that right. It's worth making really clear how your game operates. So the final type of kind of monetization is the recurring payment, the subscription offer, the VIP package, where we get a better experience if we happen to be spending on a regular basis and we opt into that spending. The initial purchase of that recurring subscription is a massive barrier. So we have to give huge amounts of value to the player, or it becomes too fatiguing. But what's fascinating about that is that the players who spend the first time, often the value of it ongoing is less problematic to them. What that means is it's a bit like the gym membership. How many of us have gone to a gym? We've spent our monthly direct debit. We go, first month, incredible. Second month, incredible. Third month, kind of okay. Fourth month, we've forgotten about it. And we forget to cancel our direct debit because we don't want to admit to ourselves that we've given up. And so the gym gets lots of its revenue from people who don't go. You don't want to do that. You want to be constantly reminding players the value that they're getting, because we want them to leave the game positive. We don't want them to be leaving the game and thinking that we cheated them. There's a whole history of use of subscription models badly in the past, particularly around wallpapers and ring tunes. We don't want to go down that line where people end up resenting the whole business model, and it destroys it for everybody. So it's worth being careful. Think about the monetization of what's right for your player. So is there a hybrid model? So I'm going to argue that there is a hybrid model. The hybrid model is exemplified at the moment by Arch Hero. I like Arch Hero a lot. What's interesting here is if you look at the downloads, you've got the peak and decline, very similar to the Plank and Pokemon Go. Bear in mind, though, this is only been around for a year or so, just under. So it's a relatively shorter time frame than the previous graphs. But look at the revenue model. It's almost a flat line. That's what we're looking for, is that kind of flat line. So you could argue it's a successful hybrid model. So how does it do it? Well, it's because it builds it in layers. So you have your access point, you make a choice as you start the functionality you're going to do. Which power up am I going to take? Am I going to take the Blaze? I'm going to take the Death Nova. I'm going to take the HP boost. I can choose my strategy. And this changes through my play session. It has no effect post-play session, but it creates a sense of momentum and makes every time I play the game feel fresh. That's really clever. Then we've got the gameplay, and it's incredibly rich. And as I go on, the level of bullets and flashes and explosions and lasers increase, and it gets really almost like a shmup, like a kind of those kind of amazing Japanese shoot 'em ups. That kind of intensive experience, I love it. And then I eventually will fail, and then I get to see that I've done better than 69% of the other players. I immediately get a social value for that. Small one, but I get some social value for it. I've also got rewards, and I use those rewards to upgrade my character so that the next time I play, I have a real sense of purpose and progression. Well, you have a sense of progression. I would argue you don't have much of a sense of purpose. Now, there are ways that you do get a sense of purpose. If you look at the island, I can see what chapter I'm on. I'm on chapter 4 now, not chapter 2. I've been playing a bit more. But I know that I've got a finite level of chapters to go through in order to then unlock the next chapter. So that does give me a small sense of progression. But I think where Arch Hero fails, if it does fail, it's an amazing game, I'm not trying to think it's a bad thing, it doesn't have the sort of longer term midpoint, the middle game kind of retention model. Now, I think its efforts to do that come into the VIP program. And so they have effectively a battle pass like program where you get bonus rewards above and beyond what a non-paying user would get. And that's great. I'm not sure there's enough compulsion to care about it. And I think that's really the lesson. So what I'm trying to say essentially is, if we take and look at our games as layers, if we build a mechanic, if we build a context loop, if we build a metagame, and we look at that as a journey of the player and where we can add value to the player through that journey, then we can create more lifetime value. So let's look at games as hypotheses. Hypercasual is focused on the mechanic and it tests that. Why aren't we taking successful mechanics and then applying context loops to them and trying different context loops until we find the one that's optimal? And then build that. And then when we found the optimal context loop and to the optimal mechanic, why do we start looking at the metagame, the optimal metagame for that mechanic? We'll find lots of approaches that can work. I'm sure that the tournament system that Golf Clash uses is an incredibly flexible and useful model that can be repurposed for lots of different mechanics. In fact, we've already seen a whole bunch of people doing that. Essentially, even Golf Clash is a variant of Clash Royale in the first place. So what I'm trying to get across to you is when you look at your casual game, think about the player first, think about what they're going to play, the mechanic, test that. Then think about the context, why they play that game, test that, and then think about the metagame, why they keep playing that game, what the context of that game is to the wider world, and test that. And if we design games as a hypothesis, we'll tend to have more successful games. So thank you for listening. I've been Oscar Clark from Fundamentally Games. We help with things like market insight, funding support, particularly in the UK. We look at design and production. We look at launch and live operations, and we do mentoring and training. If you want to know more about what we do, you can go look at fundamentallygames.com, or you can follow me on Twitter, and I'm that funny name, Athanasius. So thank you very much.